Rob, take it away.
Thanks. This is an idea I've been interested in for quite a while. I was somewhat, I think, earlier in my career, but perhaps the same era that Rob started thinking about this. So this is an idea that occurred to me sitting in a freshman economics class in college. That we had studied the effects of taxes, income taxes and payroll taxes and things like that, and sort of showed how that was bad for the economy by discouraging jobs and savings and stuff like that. And then a couple of weeks later, we covered this concept of externalities that Rob talked about, and learned how putting in place a tax on a polluting good can make the economy more efficient. And if you put those two ideas together, you get to the kind of tax shift that we're talking about today. So this is really something where the basic concept is very much, it is freshman level economics. Anyway, so this was the late in the Bush administration that this had hit me. The first Bush administration. I wasn't in college during, but it's it's an idea that's been it was certainly not the only person that it occurred to, but it is something that it's a freshman level economics idea. Once you start looking at it more carefully, there are a whole lot of things that get well beyond freshman economics, but the basic concept isn't any more complicated than that. Rob did a great job outlining sort of the basic arguments there, so I won't say much more about that. But again, just to reiterate this idea that you're trying to get rid of a tax that's holding up the economy in one case, and you're trying to put in a tax that makes polluters pay the full cost of the pollution that they're causing. In the other case, that again, this idea that goods sold in a free market economy, the prices should reflect the full cost of producing those goods, the full cost of using those goods. And without some sort of policy to deal with that, that's not true for goods that cause pollution. So that's the key concept. Interestingly, it's worth noting that if you take some of the recent estimates, so the U.S. government did an interagency panel trying to estimate how much the damage is per ton of carbon emitted into the atmosphere, and came up with a range of estimates between $5 and about $75 a ton of CO2 for the damage, aggregating all the way out into the future, aggregating across the whole world, stuff like that. With the center of that range being somewhere around $25 or $30 a ton. There's a ton of controversy about those numbers. There's some people who insist that that number should be zero. The British government has done a careful study that's coming up with numbers well over $100. But this pretty careful U.S. government study came up with numbers in the $25 to $30 range. Interestingly, some work I've done and work other people have done suggests that that would bring in just about exactly the amount of revenue, at least in the near term, necessary to continue the 2% payroll tax cut we've had for the last few years. So which is kind of an interesting coincidence. So the economic argument for the carbon tax says price in the full cost. If you do that, that's in the ballpark of the right amount of revenue to continue this payroll tax cut. So I'm going to talk mostly the rest of my time about some of the effects this would have, some of the trade-offs involved, and try and compare it to some other policies you might consider. So first, on the environment, let me just note again that the major reason to do this is to do something about global warming, global climate change, whatever you want to call it. But there are other arguments out there. There are a lot of other things that are correlated with carbon emissions. So if you can cut back on carbon emissions, you cut back on a lot of other pollutants too. Local air pollution, to the extent that you cut back on driving, you cut back on traffic congestion. Carbon tax is not the best way to address any of those problems, but it does something on them. This also does something for sort of all the arguments on using less fossil fuels, so national security arguments and stuff like that. Again, not necessarily the best way to get at that if that's the only thing you care about, but it's sort of an additional potential benefit of this. And then also, I think a benefit that often gets overlooked is that having a carbon tax obviates the need for a lot of other policies. That you don't really need a lot of the other regulations, incentives, stuff like that. You can sort of do a piecemeal approach of subsidizing clean fuels and putting in regulations and putting in fuel economy standards. And if you sort of add all those up, you may get to sort of a crude approximation of what a carbon tax would do. So it's a whole lot simpler to do the carbon tax. So that sort of simplicity and transparency argument is a big part of this. There's a general consensus among economists that a carbon tax is probably the most cost-effective way of dealing with the carbon problem, dealing with climate change. Cap and trade type policies can come close to that, but only if you do things like auction off the permits instead of giving them out for free, put in various things like a price floor and a price cap in order to keep the price from being too volatile, things that solve some of the problems that the European Union has encountered with their emissions trading system. If you do all those things, you're pretty close to what a carbon tax can do. But a lot of the other policies out there are significantly less cost effective on the environmental front. The other three criteria that I want to talk about are economic. So short-run growth or stimulus, long-run growth, and sort of the distributional effects. And I'll try and run fairly quickly through those. The short-run growth and stimulus piece is probably the least researched part of this that I'll talk about today, at least in the carbon tax context. There's a ton of macroeconomic research out there on stimulus, but nobody's really sort of linked that to the carbon tax very well. But just drawing on that broader macro literature, in general, a tax is going to be something of a drag on the economy in the short run, something that puts more money into the economy, something that gets people to spend, is going to provide a boost. If you look at, and probably the biggest thing on that is how progressive the tax or sort of cut in taxes is. So if you've got money going to poorer people, they tend to spend it faster than wealthier people. Because they're sort of, have a lot less slack in their budget, and so it's a lot less likely to go into the bank, a lot more likely to get spent. In that sense, a carbon tax is a little bit regressive and likely to be sort of more of a drag on the economy in the short run than a typical tax would be. On the other hand, the payroll tax probably goes even further in that direction. And so the net of these would probably be a short-run boost, something of a short-run stimulus. So, but we don't really know a lot about the carbon tax in that case. So there's some uncertainty there. Longer run growth is really a very different situation. We're not talking about stimulus, we're really talking about sort of increasing the long run productivity of the economy. So making the economy run more efficiently and getting more capital and labor, sort of the factors of production in there. The carbon tax is probably something of a drag on capital and labor supply by itself. But if you take the revenue from that and use it in some productive way, that can offset or more than offset that effect. So you can get a net gain out of that. That's ignoring the environmental piece of this. And it's fairly clear that climate change is going to be a negative for long-run growth. There's a huge amount of uncertainty about how much of a negative it is. But things like having increased risk of storms that destroy productive capacity or shut down very productive parts of the economy for some period of time. Shutting down all of lower Manhattan for a week is not good for the economy. So preventing that sort of thing. But trying to measure that is incredibly difficult. Measure it, predict it, anything like that. But that's a piece of this that's understudied and is not included in a lot of the numbers out there. But the general conclusion is that depending on what you do with the revenue, you can probably get a little bit of a boost to long-run growth. The best things in terms of the long-run growth aspect are probably cutting the deficit or cutting capital taxes rather than cutting payroll taxes. But cutting payroll taxes is a significant boost there too. So that's probably the piece where the payroll tax looks worst, and even there it looks pretty good. So fourth criteria, the distributional piece. As I mentioned, talking about short-run effects, the carbon tax is mildly regressive. Energy goods are a fairly big share of poor people's budgets relative to wealthier people. But a lot of the indirect spending on energy, buying products that use energy to produce them, actually tends to go more the other way. So once you take into account the direct and the indirect spending on energy, you get back to something that's much closer to being a proportional tax. It's still mildly regressive, but only mildly. And the payroll tax is more regressive than that. So the net effect of these is going to be something that's better for lower income people, worse for higher income people than not doing that shift. And that's a significant advantage. So both from the short-run stimulus perspective and just from an income distribution standpoint, that this is a problem that the country has, that sort of the inequality has grown significantly in recent years. And this is sort of at least a small way to move in that direction. One potential issue on this is the effects on different age groups. That the payroll tax cut doesn't help retired people at all. So a carbon tax will do something to push up prices of things that older people are buying. So that's the one group that might well, one potentially economically vulnerable group that might well come out worse off out of this. Although indexing of Social Security benefits, the cost of living adjustments, actually picks up a big chunk of that. So this is a lot less of a problem than you might think about it to begin with. But it is something that, as part of a policy like this, we might want to think about some way of dealing with lower income elderly people. So put all of this together, you have a policy that is sort of the best policy that you could do from an environmental standpoint, compared to all the other things that would deal with this, deal with the carbon policy. What you're doing with the revenue, if you do a payroll tax cut, is probably the best in terms of the short-run growth stimulus issue. So doing this tax swap is going to be at least mildly stimulative in the short run. Long-run growth, this is probably the place where the payroll tax looks weakest compared to things like cutting the deficit, but still looks pretty good. So particularly once you take into account the benefits of the preventing climate change, you're probably looking at a net positive for long-run growth. And then distributional effects, this is going to be mildly progressive. Not a huge step that direction, but at least a small step that direction. And as long as you do something about low-income elderly, things works out fairly well from that standpoint. So, so it's really one that on any of these criteria, some of these criteria it looks great, some of them it just looks good, but there's really no sort of, on those four criteria, there's no major gap. So I've probably talked a little bit more than my time, and we stop there, and I look forward to everybody's questions.
Great. Thanks so much. Sue? That would be fun, yeah. Can I just make one 30-second comment?
Make a minute comment.
We as a society, and for that matter as a species, seem to have difficulty responding to threats of a particular type until the very last moment or the very last portion of the decade. And the type of problem that Rob and Rob have pointed out here in terms of climate change falls into that context of immense scale and one that needs or warrants front-loaded action. And that's another merit of what is being described here in terms of a carbon tax, to front-load prices on this, to alter behaviors such that we're not in the 11th hour needing to adjust, because economies don't perform particularly well when they only have a millisecond to respond to a boatload of problems up front. So I'd like to just add that to the line of argumentation. Sue, take it over.
Okay, well, go ahead.
Okay, I have a lot to say about this, unfortunately. I'll try to keep it short.
Yeah, and please try to keep as a question, and if you would re-identify yourselves so that
okay.
helpful.
I'm Dave Rabinowitz, retired engineer, and I have some real problems with a lot of what was said. And I'll try to make it very brief. But first about jobs. There's this myth that we have a shortage of jobs. What we have is a shortage of unskilled jobs. If you're looking for somebody with skill, there are companies out there desperately trying to find people. There are people trying to get the visa requirements changed and all that. So what we need is not so much jobs. We need unskilled jobs, which have all gone overseas for the most part. Now, Companies do not create jobs because they have money. There are companies, big corporations, sitting on billions of dollars and laying off people, while there are other companies that are borrowing money to hire people. Companies create jobs because they have work to do. And right now, it's been more than 70 years since we went to a 40-hour work week, from what had been 60 hours generally. Since that time, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, non-farm productivity has gone up by 5 times. And people are still working 40 hours. And are we 5 times happier, 5 times better off? Maybe in some ways you might calculate it, but the question is, does it really make sense to do what we're doing now? There's a lot of wasted labor. And we're in a very temporary situation. The baby boom cohort is about to totally retire, and there are a lot of companies that are saying we're going to lose all our skilled people. So I'd say 5 years from now, people are going to be wondering, where are we going to get labor, not where are we going to get jobs. So any kind of fix now, we want to be short term. But from the point of view of the carbon tax, encouraging people to stop using carbon, the way you get people to change what they're doing is not by punishing them, it's by providing them with a preferable alternative. I could put a massive tax on food, but you're not going to stop eating because you don't have an alternative. Now, in terms of use of carbon, 125 years ago, nobody owned a car. And people survived. They lived very good lives. They lived complete lives. We can't go back to that today, not because of what we think, but because we don't have the infrastructure in place. They had a good infrastructure. Yeah, so I'm going to ask if you want to respond to any of that. But I'm raising these issues because basically, I have a problem with economics.
Well, with all respect, I disagree with almost everything you said. First of all, there are shortages of some skilled labor. There are excesses of other skills. There are a broad range of skills in this economy, and there are a lot of skilled people who are out of work today because they don't have the particular skills that are being demanded. The issue of, and there's actually not a shortage of unskilled labor. Immigration has addressed that, frankly. But you are right that businesses create jobs when there is demand for the things that they produce, the goods and services they produce. And part of the point of a payroll tax is to stimulate demand. There is, however, in addition, although it has, you stimulate demand, particularly if you cut the employee side of the payroll tax. You change the factor price if you cut the employer side of the payroll tax. But there is something new happening in job markets, which we've observed in the last expansion. There is a different response by business to increases in demand with respect to creating jobs. That's in the data, and it is a discontinuity. It is a sharp break from everything we've seen for 40 years. The only question is whether it's temporary or something structural. But there is no doubt about the change in the response of business to increases in demand with respect to creating jobs. And with respect to the issue of how you get people to change their behavior, the best lever we know of, we're economists, is prices. That's what gets people to change. You're not saying, first of all, you're not saying that people won't consume energy. You're asking, there is a variety of different kinds of energy to consume. In addition, as the price goes up, people put a higher premium on more energy efficient technologies. So you get the development of those technologies as well as those fuels, and people favor them because the price signal tells them to favor.
Yeah, I think Rob covered everything. Just hitting that last point more, the needing to sort of provide good alternatives. In part, the good alternatives are there. That there are there are things like switching from coal to natural gas, which is very easy to do. There are things that go beyond that that are switching, going to non-emitting technologies. And there are things like just cutting back on use of energy in general. All of those options are there. So the analogy of, if you put a huge tax on food, people wouldn't eat less, isn't really the right analogy. That the right analogy is if you put a huge tax on certain kinds of food. People would switch to other foods, and people would waste less of the food that gets taxed. And that's a big part of what the idea of a carbon tax is. That what you're trying to do is get people to switch to cleaner forms of energy. And in addition, you're trying to get people to use the dirty forms of energy more wisely, conserve a little bit more, stuff like that. There are other ways you could do that. Carbon tax is not the only way that you could get all of those things to happen. But it's one policy that gives an incentive for every one of those things. Whereas other things that you could do, subsidizing particular clean energy or encouraging particular means of conservation, just target very narrow slices of that. So, and it's sort of one simple policy that gives an across-the-board incentive for that. The other piece of this is it gives an incentive to create new technologies. That you give, once you've put that tax in place, now there's a market for, the market is going to want things that are low carbon. Not because they're sort of good people, but because it saves them money. And that means businesses then can see they can make money by coming up with those cleaner technologies. So all of that with one policy. And there's a lot of evidence people do respond to prices. So.
It is important to realize, by the way, that economists don't assert that taxes are a pure substitute for other non-taxation kinds of tools. That taxation or the position of a price can be a complement to other actions that are undertaken.
That leads in perfectly to my question, which was, with these policies that would have a long-term stimulative effect on the economy, how do you convince businesses, both large and small, to get on board with this concept? Especially since they would get the fixed cost of the payroll tax would be lower, and they would have the opportunity to get these